you can see the screens. I just read from the top. So top means that many people read the same question. So what do new models of theological training that are rooted in the majority world and Asian culture looks like in reality? Maybe Bishop Hwa-Young can answer for these questions. Yeah.
I think if you notice what I was trying to say was that many of us have started with the Western models. We have not moved away from the Western model. Hang on, excuse me one more. Right. And consequently, that's what's troubling me. So where we need to think about new models is what I was splitting for, where we need to think about, how should I say? We can see some new models in a sense in places like where there's been a lot of church growth, like in the Chinese house churches or in the Indian grassroots churches. I think if the training can be done together with the actual ministry, that would be one way forward. Now, incidentally, I'm a Methodist, for those of you who don't know. And in fact, when early Methodism started, John Wesley did not have preachers. He had to train many of them, his own preachers, many of them who had no education. And that's exactly how he started. He trained people who were on the ground. And in fact, he did a training and he integrated training and a ministry together. So those early Methodist ministers had to go through 4 years of training minimum. I think that's what's the pattern that's being followed by some of our grassroots churches. I think that's one thing. I think we need to think much more. The other thing that I think we need to think about is, quite apart from the issues I really raised, is whether we can begin to, if we are serious about integrating theological training to, theological studies together with ministry training, we need to look at the medical schools much more closely. There they managed to integrate academic training together with the actual practice of medicine. Now, a lot of our seminaries send our students out for field work, but I've worked long enough in seminaries to know that a lot of field education training is actually not adequate at all. What happens is that most of the past students who are sent out for field work are actually used as cheap labor by the churches to act as assistant pastor. But there's no proper integration. And I think that if we're going to move away from the academic model that's being used, we need to give some thought to these areas.
Okay, thank you. So, Lindsay, can you add some on this question? The three questions is all related. Can you add some advice from the historical church point of view? What kind of things we should not miss when we have our own theological training program from Asia Church?
I don't think this is my area of expertise, but I see that in European theological institutions, very few of them actually are providing teaching and modeling on evangelism and mission, which surprises me. One major college in Britain, because of financial problems, has just been told by its board to release one professor, and the one they released was the professor for evangelism, which says a lot about the college, probably. I think from what Hwa-Young says, a balance of classroom education and also exposure to good human models is crucial. What strikes me, I think Chandapilla raised this in his book about Jesus, the master trainer, that the way that Jesus equipped the disciples was that he spent time with them. He retreated to be with them. And I think often we need to catch things from good models. I remember once asking Samuel Escobar, who is, as Hwa-Young said, a great missiologist. I said to him, "How do you learn, Samuel?" Is it through reading books, through the classroom, or something else? And he said, the primary way I learn, this is a great missiologist, is doing what we're doing now, Lindsay, dialoguing and debating one-to-one. And that's why I recommend with Hua Yong's paper that the best way to deal with that is to disseminate it and to try to get church leaders not to be threatened by the challenges, but to dialogue humbly and graciously and ask whether these things are true, whether they need to be fine-tuned, what we can learn, what we need to repent of. It's by spending time with godly models, which clearly Wesley established in his style, alongside some input and teaching, formal teaching. That kind of balance is really vital, whereas one of the weaknesses of the West is we move too much to a lecture style delivery of formal material. So there's an imbalance there which needs to be corrected.
Okay, can we see the other questions?
What?
Thank you. Yeah, this is another question. Is the center of gravity just about the number? Or is it also about the influence and power? In each case, is it really true that center of gravity has moved from west to a majority wall? This is the question. Yeah, maybe both of you can answer on this question. Yeah.
Lindsay, why don't you go first?
Yeah.
No, I'll let you go first, Hua Yong.
That's a
Okay,
good tactic.
before I go into it, I just want to make one comment. Please don't get me wrong in what I say about theological education, that I don't think we need good, sound academic teaching in theology. I think we do need that. There's too much heresies in our churches today. But my plea is, how can we combine good, sound theological teaching with helping a student to emerge as a person of prayer and a person who knows how to do evangelism, church planting, pastoral work? That's my plea, all right? So, so please don't go away saying that I'm trying to run down theological education as it is. That's not my, okay, coming to the question of, the question is, the center of gravity of the church in terms of the West, in terms of numbers, have moved from the West into the majority world. But the person who raised the question rightly pointed out, the center of influence today are still largely in the West. Denominational headquarters, seminaries offering PhD programs, mission agency with plenty of money, publication. You go to any book, for example, you go to a bookshop in my country, 90% of the books are published in Britain and in America. You listen to the music. I complained last night. I'm sorry about this for those of you who like music the last 3 nights. I said, last 3 nights, when we're supposed to be Asian conference, we had Western music on our worship. So the influence is very strong, overwhelming. And we need to break away from it. So the influence is still there. So unfortunately, that's the case. So we have to consciously make a break. So for example, I say to people, I say, when you send your students to do PhD, even okay, in the West, they still are the best institutions. But why are you sending them to do just Old Testament studies, New Testament studies, theology? And then when they write on church history, you insist that they write on something about Western church history. Can't they write a thesis on their own church history in their own country? And can't they be going to do PhD studies, not necessarily in the traditional Western seminary areas, theological disciplines, but can they be writing Buddhism, Hinduism, Chinese culture, Islam, and begin to out of that develop a good apologetics, like people like the early church fathers, Irenaeus, and people like Tertullian, who was able to out-argue the pagan philosophers because they had first mastered pagan philosophy. My question about the Indian friend who said he cannot think of anyone who could stand toe-to-toe with the Hindu intellectuals was exactly the point I was trying to make. We need to produce men and women who can stand toe-to-toe with these Hindus, philosophers, Buddhist philosophers, most Islamic scholars, and be able to argue and show why we believe Jesus Christ has the answer. I think that's the sort of thing that we do. But you're not going to produce those scholars if you only insist that they're going to study Western systematic theology. And all you read is Moltmann, Tannenberg, Karl Barth, etc. So that's my first comment. My second comment is this. Western theology will remain very parochial if we don't push them. Professor Andrew Walsh made one comment. He says, you go to do a PhD in African studies in any major Western universities. One of the things that you got to understand about Africa is the church in Africa. So you go to study African studies, but you must understand about African Christianity. But the problem, he says, you go to any Western seminary to study theology, they don't teach you anything about the church in the non-Western world. He says, don't you realize that doesn't Western theologians will remain very parochial. They remain very close-minded. They only think that the answers come out of the West. And this is where we need a challenge. I think I've said enough. Lindsay, please.
Okay.
I do think it's important for people to become aware of their own history, if the church has existed in their country or their region for quite some time. And in fact, I make it a practice whenever I travel to anywhere in the world, I encourage the student movements to write up their own history and see it as part of the growth of the work in their region of the world, because then you can draw on the lessons. If somebody is writing even a 50-page history, it doesn't have to be 250 pages, but I think reflecting on the roots and the growth of the work in a country or a region and lessons learned from it is a very healthy development. And other literature, of course, comes from that. In terms of the question about influence and power, I always feel uncomfortable with the word power in relation to global leadership in the church. Influence is probably a better word. All I would say here is that it takes time historically for influence to shift from one region to another. If you asked, for example, in the first 300 years, who were the great leaders in the church in the year 300 AD, you wouldn't have had any Northern European names or North American or Asian. They would have been Southern Europeans and North Africans. That's where the influence, and if you like, the power lay. It often is the case that when there is a shift in terms of the number of believers in a country or a region, also, it takes decades, sometimes a generation or two, for us to see God raising up a new generation of leaders who can think not only about the application of the gospel in their cultures, but have a word, something to say to the global church. And all I would say is that if I look back over 45 years in student ministry, in the early years, people like John Stott and even Billy Graham were perhaps influential global figures. I am seeing the emergence of more people in the non-Western world who are significant forces and voices for biblical Christianity. And they will be listened to in due course. I hear them even in European conferences. In the Welsh Evangelical Forum, we have somebody from another part of the world every year. So we've had Ajit Fernando, Ramesh Atala, a bishop from Jos in the last few weeks, Patrick Fung. The reality is people want to hear authoritative, authentic voices where these leaders speak with grace and humility, and their tone is important too. When you have such folks, people will always be attracted to hear them, but it takes time for growth in numbers to issue in growth in maturity and the formation of significant global figures. It's not primarily to do with money. Money is a factor, but those voices will be heard increasingly. I think we'll see it more in the next 20, 30 years. as God raises up significant factors, leaders in other parts of the world. And for those people, as they begin to develop, the other thing would be, it's crucial to develop friendships with key leaders in other parts of the world. That's been my experience in IFES and to some extent in Lausanne. When you meet with leaders in other parts of the world, you are challenged to think afresh about your own perspective. And it's also easier to take critiques from voices in other parts of the world, from people who are humble friends. You can take a strong challenge from a friend. If someone is unknown and there's no contact, then it's more difficult.
Thank
So
you.
global gatherings are important too.
Right. Thank you. Maybe we have maybe 5 minutes to left. So I have a question to both of you. It seems to me when I hearing your presentation, it seems to me both of you very much agree with each other's opinion. But is there any point that you would disagree or you want to balancing in some point of each other's points? Would you say? Can you say on that? To make this discussion more exciting. I want to see you just debate with certain point. I know you are very good friends. Yeah, I know. Yeah, we are very good friends, but
I think Lindsay and myself has got a slight difference of opinion on the place of the supernatural in Christianity. We have interacted briefly in our emails. I take the position where I think we need to return to the New Testament pattern, that the supernatural is not something extraordinary. I think Lindsay takes a slightly more cautious position. I don't know whether it's because he's such a strong reform man, but Lindsay, would you like to comment on that?
For me, it's more a question. Is God a supernatural God? Yes. Conversion is a supernatural event. It's probably the primary supernatural event. I remember being on OM in South Africa, going to a community where remarkable things were happening. They even talked of resurrections. I went back to the Lagos ship on which I was, and I said to my roommate, who was from Malaysia, and my Irish roommate, I've just seen somebody who said they were raised from the dead. What do you think of that? And they said, that's nothing, Lindsay. You've been raised from the dead too. You were dead in your trespasses and sins, and look at you now. So there is a danger of playing down the supernatural act of conversion, because I often hear Christians saying, I've never seen anything supernatural in my life, to which I say, well, if you've become a Christian, that's a supernatural act of God. What about the experience of the supernatural in terms of overt miracles that Hua Jung speaks about? My question is simply that some people would argue that these events occur more frequently in the birth of a church or the early years of the life of a church. I don't have a conviction about that. It's just an observation that they often seem to be more plentiful in times of initial birth and growth of a church. Do they still happen in the West today? They actually happen more than you think. I've just been reading something this morning, a PhD on supernatural miracles in the church in Wales, where I live. And there are many Christians of Pentecostal and charismatic backgrounds here. So, but my question is more in terms of the frequency of the overtly supernatural events. The other observation I would make is that the great church historian Kenneth Scott Latourette said that we have 6 weapons in our armament: evangelism, prayer, argument, community, and suffering. And the only observation I would say there is that God often uses our response to adversity to bring other people to faith as a powerful testimony. Very briefly, may I say, my only daughter died 34 years ago. My parents became believers, and my son, my only son, became a believer as a result of how they saw my wife and I respond to the loss of our daughter. When my son was baptized years later, they asked him in public, how did you become a Christian? He said, and he had never told me this, I watched my parents when my sister died, and I saw that they were not bitter against God. And in my parents' case, my father asked to see me just after her death and said, your mother and I want to be baptized. I said, you've got to become a Christian first. And I said, I've been a Christian for 20 years. Why is it taking you so long? And he said, well, I've seen so many charlatans in the church. But he said, Lindsay, you can't fake hope in the midst of adversity. You have it, and your mother and I want it. So we're ready. So after all those years of witness, what was powerful in their case, that doesn't diminish the fact that God does heal children of sicknesses or heal other people. He does. I don't know why he doesn't heal some, but when that doesn't happen, in terms of balance, all I would say don't forget the role of Christian testimony in response to suffering as a powerful testimony before the watching world.
Thank you.
I would just add this
comment.
comment,
Sure.
and it's this that I'm glad for Lindsay's comment. And I think sometimes we in the majority world, when we talk about the supernatural, there are many groups that just overemphasize it. They talk about nothing but the supernatural, but their lives are in a mess. And they think that by having a so-called what they call anointing, the church will grow. It doesn't happen. The church will explode in the end. So I think having said that we need to recover the supernatural, Lindsay has rightly pointed out, we must never overemphasize it. What's the place of suffering, for example, and everyday Christian living? How does that impact other people's lives? We need to be able to combine the supernatural with the way we live. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lindsay and Hwa-Young. Actually, I myself has a lot of questions after I hear from you, and then but we are out of time, so we need to finish our Q&A now. So thank you very much for your contribution and then answering the question.